In a time when people will commonly riot because their sports team won a championship, it's important to note that one of the most common reasons that people have rioted in history is because they lacked food. Food riots still occur in the world in modern times. In 1766, in Nottingham, England, what began as anger over a poor harvest eventually spiraled out of control and turned into a riot where people were breaking windows and looting shops. But it was the object of their looting that made this particular riot interesting. The rioters were after cheese. The Great Cheese Riot of 1766 deserves to be remembered. Food riots were not uncommon in England in the 18th century, and indeed isolated instances of rioting over food and hunger had plagued England for centuries before that. But in many ways, the poor rioting over food changed in the waves of riots that occurred beginning in 1740. The 1740 riots were the first national wave of riots over food and were different in character. In his book, The Politics of Hunger, author Carl Griffin argues that the riots in the 18th century took on a more stately form, with a particular emphasis on preventing the export of food and even the destruction of food as justified by claims of starvation. In May of 1740, a group of women attacked a ship loaded with grain to prevent exportation. According to the magistrate, the women swear that they will die before any corn shall be exported, for they had better be killed or hanged than starved. Another wave of riots followed in 1756-57. These riots targeted middlemen in particular, arguing that starvation and hunger was caused not by actual shortage, but by market manipulation. One farmer received a threatening letter that read, "You covetous and hard-hearted farmers, that heap your stacks and mows of corn to starve the poor, if you will not take them in and sell them that we may some to eat, we will put them down for you." The letter was signed, "Jack Poor, Will Needy, Will Starve, Peter Fear Not," and others. While it is difficult to compare historical prices to modern ones, Dr. Robert Hume concludes that only 3% of families in England and Wales had enough income for more than a bare minimum of cultural products. The lack of discretionary income meant that cost increases could easily put poor families at risk of starvation. In the wake of the 1756 and 57 riots, the government had attempted to keep prices stable by law and prohibited the export of grain until March 25, 1759. The crisis in 1766 was brought on by several factors. One was the 7 Years' War. The war ended in a major victory for England and her allies, and England gained territory, including Canada, Florida, multiple islands in the Caribbean, and in India. But despite winning, the war had been expensive and left England in considerable debt and with new territory to manage. The British national debt nearly doubled from 1755 to 1764, and interest payments exceeded half of the British government's budget. Possibly the most famous consequences of the debt incurred during the war were the taxes passed on the American colonies, such as the 1764 Sugar Act and the 1765 Stamp Act. In England, however, tax burdens were actually much higher than in the colonies, even after the acts were passed. Harvests in England had been poor since 1763, and prices for grain began to rise significantly. Parliament removed the duties on imported wheat and flour and the bounty on exported wheat in 1764, and the king himself prohibited the exportation of wheat, meal, flour, bread, biscuit, and starch when prices continued to rise during Parliament's recess. 1766 saw another poor harvest, about two-thirds of an average crop in England, but the situation worsened as the harvest was weak across the continent. There was a famine in Ireland. Parliament continued to try and address the situation, allowing grain to be imported duty-free from the American colonies, and the exportation of grain and flour was forbidden until August 26, 1766. But these actions failed to remedy the situation. The winter of 1765-66 saw sporadic violence. In Dorset, a crowd of 600 men stopped corn from being exported, while in Hampshire, several granaries were burned. In March, mobs near Bradford-on-Avon began stopping almost every wagon that passes the road in order to examine whether it is loaded with wheat, to prevent it being transported, and the crowd forced the sale of other staples like butter, cheese, and bacon at reduced prices. Parliament wasn't sitting on August 26th when the ban on exportation would end, and merchants began buying up what grain there was in anticipation, hoping to take advantage of the poor harvest on the continent to make large profits. Grain prices fluctuated wildly, and riots began to break out in August. A crowd at Newbury seized meat, bacon, eggs, and butter, and in Birmingham, a mob forced butter sellers to lower their prices. Harvest time in September was usually a time when prices would fall, but instead they remained steady as grain was stored for exportation. In mid-September, isolated protests and mobs began an extended wave of rioting across much of southern England. On September 16th, the poor in Wiltshire rioted over grain, seizing the grain and selling it at reduced prices. They were kind enough to return the proceeds and even the grain sacks to the farmers afterward. Then the mob turned to a nearby mill, seizing hoarded foodstuffs. 7 or 8 mills were eventually destroyed. Eris's Birmingham Gazette published a letter that reported, "We have nothing but insurrections of the poor for bread, who are burning and pulling down the mills of those whom they know to be sending meat to Bristol." Within a 12-week period, there were more than 60 incidences of rioting, and the annual register described 30 riots in September alone by the poor, who had been driven by desperation and madness by the exorbitant prices of all manner of provisions. One particular event from September was widely reported. A mob marched towards Trowbridge and were intercepted by several gentlemen who attempted to calm the mob with a promise to help lower prices. The crowd wasn't satisfied and declared that they might as well be hanged as starve to death, that they had not eaten a morsel of bread for 3 days. One witness reported that many in the crowd could scarcely crawl. They marched onto a mill of a known grain hoarder who defended his mill with firearms. According to a mobber who wrote to the Salisbury and Winchester Journal, the mob acquired their own weapons and began a regular fight for 3/4 of an hour. Many were wounded, and finally the mob was able to sneak up on the mill and set it ablaze. On September 26th, the government, realizing that they had a crisis on their hands, issued an order banning the exportation of wheat. But even that couldn't stop the weight of events. On October 2nd, Nottingham held its annual Goose Fair. The fair was a long-standing tradition with origins in the Feast of Matthew the Apostle, which the city had celebrated from around 1,000 years. The fair was given a royal charter in 1164, which forbade other competitor fairs from organizing in the area. The fair became known as the Goose Fair because huge numbers of geese were traditionally marched to Nottingham for sale. Roast goose was a popular meal for the Feast of Michaelmas at the end of September. By 1766, the fair was known more for the foodstuffs than livestock, including cheese. Nottingham itself was experiencing the earliest stages of industrialization. Population would spike dramatically, nearly tripling between 1750 and 1800. In 1766, it had a population of around 15,000, and the town had a growing textile industry. The number of merchant hosiers doubled between the early 1740s and 1770s. The fair itself took place in the Old Market Square. According to the Nottingham Journal, the town was full of company and a larger quantity of cheese set down than has been known for some years, but at exorbitant prices, up to 36 shillings for 112 pounds, double the price that was fixed for cheese at the Coventry market only a week earlier. But despite the price, trade went on peacefully during the day. It wasn't until that evening that things began to turn. A number of traders from Lincolnshire had come to the fair and purchased a large amount of cheese, around 60 hundredweights, according to reports. Some rude lads accosted the traders and their heap of cheese. The lads threatened the traders they should not stir a cheese till the town was served first. The traders applied for protection, but there was none to be had. At 7 o'clock, the mob became outrageous and fell upon the heaps of cheese, and amidst loud shouts in a short time took and destroyed the whole parcel, which was chiefly carried off by women and boys. Another account says that the crowd's violence broke loose like a torrent. Cheeses were rolled down Wheeler Gate and Peck Lane in abundance. Many others were carried away, and the mayor, in endeavoring to restore the peace, was knocked down with one in the open fair. That is, the popular account has the mayor standing in the middle of Peck Lane when he's rolled over by the cheese wheel. Perhaps emboldened by their success, the riot continued. Part of the mob went to the Trent bridges and searched all the warehouses, but finding no cheese, returned to town. Several of the rioters were arrested and carried before the justices at a coffee house on Peck Lane, which infuriated the already inflamed crowd. This redoubled their fury, the Nottingham Journal reported. They broke the windows belonging to the house, tore the pavement, and threatened destruction to all who opposed them. Faced with such furor, it was thought prudent to discharge the lads in custody, and the justices wisely retreated. Locals set up roadblocks to prevent anyone from taking cheese out of the city. At 11 p.m., a messenger was sent to Derby to request help to suppress the riot. And by the following morning, members of the 15th Dragoons arrived to quell the disturbance. In the market, the crowd assaulted the mayor's house while the mayor read out the Riot Act. Reading the act was a requirement of the Riot Act of 1715, or an act for preventing tumultuous and riotous assemblies, for the more speedy and effectual punishing the rioters. City officials were authorized to read a short proclamation ordering the dispersal of any group of 12 or more people who were unlawfully, riotously, and tumultuously assembled together. Our sovereign lord, the king, chargeth and commandeth all persons, being assembled, immediately to disperse themselves, and peaceably to depart to their habitations, or to their lawful business, upon the pains contained in the act made in the first year of King George, for preventing tumults and riotous assemblies. God save the king. When reading the act failed to disperseth those who were tumultuously assembled, the dragoons fired on them. The Nottingham Dale book reported that the dragoons acted with great vigor in quelling the turmoil, which was not fully subdued until blood had been shed. According to the Leicester Journal, one man was injured, a farmer named William Egglestone, who was shot in the calf of his right leg as he was kneeling and leaning over a heap of cheese. The date book records that Egglestone was guarding some cheese, or so, ironically, he likely wasn't even a rioter, but one of the cheese hoarders. The wound became infected, and he died a few days later. The most dramatic part of the riots came later, as a crowd decided to march upon a warehouse full of cheese near Derby. On October 10th, a crowd, said to be principally women and children, according to Jackson's Oxford Journal, broke into a warehouse and carried off nearly a ton of cheese. The warehouse owner collected a posse which seized 9 people, on whom the cheeses were found. A mob of about 300 marched on the warehouse, but this time the owner had 18 armed men guarding the place, with grape and small shot. The defenders drove off the mob. On Monday, a group of 30 men, led by the warehouse owners, went to nearby Dunnington, where they demanded search warrants from the local justice of the peace. But the justice refused, and after some discussion, the group broke open his outer gates and used many unbecoming expressions. A mob gathered and began throwing a great number of brickbats, stones, and etc. The mob chased the men back to the warehouse, where they seized more cheese. The paper reported that the bells rang in Dunnington as if to signal a victory had been attained, and a hogshead of ale was given to the populace. A crowd of rioters chased down a boat laden with cheese that hadn't left the warehouse, attempting to escape. The owner attempted to calm the mob, offering to sell the cheese at a discount, but one of the men in the crowd is reported to have said, "Damn his charity, we'll have his cheese for naught." And the cheese was duly seized, making it an act of course, cheese piracy. Because don't all good stories involve pirates? Historian Ned Palmer notes that in the wake of the Great Cheese Riot, the merchants became so desperate that they resorted to armed cheese convoys, although these were also sometimes raided. Riots continued through October, with peasants either seizing food or forcing it to be sold at reduced prices. The military was called out to try to quell the violence, but became increasingly spread thin as the riots became more widespread. In fact, riots continued for the next 2 years sporadically, and in fact over the course of the rest of the century when harvests were bad. Hundreds of people were arrested. Interestingly, one of the penalties you could get if you were convicted of rioting, in addition to hanging and flogging, was to be transported to America. That is to say, for the crime of stealing cheese, you could be sent here. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.